And with that, we will move to item number 3, which is the 2026, it's a receive and file, the 2026 City Council budget priorities. And there we go. All right. This background section is the same as what I covered in the previous presentation. So in the interest of time, we will move to the next slide. And I will just share with you that the 2026 budget cycle marks the second full year of implementing this framework. This year, my office and Vice Chair Koski's office launched a 2026 City Council Budget Priorities Survey as a means of collecting individual council members' input and feedback into the budget process. The 2026 City Council Budget Priorities Survey was structured around key areas to help shape budget direction, identify investment needs, and improve the shared budget process. The key areas included budget goals and priority setting, levy decisions and trade-offs, citywide budget priorities, neighborhood or region-specific budget priorities, fiscal policy considerations, performance management considerations, and process improvements. We'll move to the next slide. Now that we've covered the background and process, we'll move on to reviewing the 2026 City Council budget priorities. This report and the slide deck are available in the LIMS file. This first section is the budget goals and priorities section. This section reflects council members' overarching goals and priorities and highlights where they believe current investments may need to shift to better align with said goals. As part of our ongoing effort to align the city's budget with values-based investment and long-term planning, council members were asked to rank strategic priorities in order of importance. The priorities reflect a synthesis of existing city frameworks, including the mayor's budget priorities, the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan, and the Strategic Racial Equity Action Plan, or SREAP. The resulting strategic priorities ranked by importance, and this is a culmination of what the feedback that was shared to us by everyone, are first, affordable housing and homelessness, then community safety and police reform, then economic inclusion and living wage jobs, then racial equity and disparity reduction, then climate action and environmental justice, then public health and well-being, then effective public services and public service access, then transportation, infrastructure, and public spaces, number 9, good governance and civic participation, and finally, arts, culture, and historical preservation. Council members were then asked to identify areas where the city overinvests, specifically where funding may be exceeding need, growing too quickly, or not delivering results that match the level of investment. The results are 3 key areas that we'll talk through. The first is consultants and contractual services lacking evaluation and performance metrics. Many council members identified consultants and contractual services, particularly those lacking proper procurement evaluation, performance metrics, or accountability, as an area of overinvestment. They noted that without clear evaluation processes and measurable outcomes, it's difficult to determine whether these investments are achieving their intended goals or providing value to residents. Council members emphasized that all programs and projects, especially those involving external vendors, should demonstrate how they meet need or exceed established standards, deliver meaningful results, and remain accountable to their contractual commitments. Second, top-level management and high-cost bureaucracy. Some council members identified the growing number and cost of upper management and appointed officials as an area of overinvestment. They noted that many positions are compensated at levels exceeding top-level city and state elected officials, resulting in significant administrative overhead. Council members emphasized the need for equitable pay across departments and staff. And finally, related to the police department. Here, what we heard from some council members is identifying specific areas within the police department, including traditional law enforcement, certain sub-programs, resources, and related expenses as areas of overinvestment. They noted concerns about the return on investment of traditional law enforcement strategies compared to preventative public safety approaches, as well as spending on the chief's detail, mounted patrol, police technology and software, and legal settlement payouts. Council members emphasized the need to evaluate whether current MPD investments are delivering intended outcomes and whether resources are being allocated in ways that reflect community values, priorities, and long-term planning. Continued, we'll go over 4 more areas of overinvestment, starting with vacant positions and staffing plans. A council member identified the significant number of vacant full-time equivalent positions and unrealistic staffing plans as an area of overinvestment, noting that budget vacancies remain unfilled and cannot be filled leads to inflated budgets and increased tax burdens. Jurisdictional overlap. A council member identified jurisdictional overlap between the city, county, and state as an area of overinvestment. A council member identified pilot projects and hyperlocal or narrowly focused spending as an area of overinvestment, noting the importance of prioritizing funding for established initiatives and programs with citywide impact. And a council member identified unused city-owned buildings and properties as an area of overinvestment, noting that they could be sold to reduce costs and generate revenue. Now, these 4 are all ones where you see that these were raised by an individual council member, whereas in the previous slide, they were brought up multiple times or in different ways. With that, council members were then asked to identify areas where the city underinvests, where funding may be falling short of need, of impact, or urgency. The resulting underinvestment areas include affordable housing and homelessness, and you'll note this was the number 1 priority cumulatively when we asked about ranking strategic priorities as well. Many council members identified affordable housing and homelessness as an area of underinvestment, noting concerns regarding insufficient funding for affordable housing and homelessness in general, and lifting up specifically the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, the NOAA Preservation Fund, affordable housing preservation and maintenance, multi-generational family housing options, senior housing, low barrier shelters, supportive housing projects specifically. Council members emphasized the need for sustained investment to keep residents stably housed and to stay on track towards long-term housing goals. Next, many council members identified neighborhood traffic calming, you'll be shocked to learn, as an area of underinvestment. They noted that despite high demands, increased driver, pedestrian, and cyclist injuries, and the city's commitment through the Vision Zero Action Plan, current funding remains insufficient to meet the needs and public safety goals. Next, climate programs and initiatives. Some council members identified participation in these programs remains low, particularly in low-income and renter communities, and emphasized the need for targeted, well-funded efforts to expand accessibility, awareness, and engagement. Next is proactive enforcement, where council members noted proactive enforcement's role in advancing housing and tenant protections, workers' rights, public health, climate action, environmental justice and community safety, and noted the need for increased housing inspector and stronger code enforcement to uphold tenants' rights. And then street lighting, noted significant service gaps, backlogs, and extended response times, all of which contribute to ongoing safety concerns in neighborhoods across the city. Continued, additional areas of underinvestment. So a council member identified basic services and 311 response as an area of underinvestment, with noting delays in response time, basic service delivery, and negative constituent and resident experience. A council member identified ADA compliance, in particular public spaces like sidewalks and crosswalks that don't comply with standards. A council member identified the health department and the withdrawal of federal funding and its impact on our ability to implement public health approaches on several issues. A council member identified public bathrooms, noting that peer cities provide these types of facilities. A council member noted violence prevention funding, noting GVI, group violence intervention, youth group violence intervention, next step, community trauma response, safety ambassadors, and other specific initiatives. A council member identified the Ownership and Opportunity Fund as an area of economic development underinvestment. And a council member identified frontline employees and the need for strengthening staffing, compensation, and retention for critical services. A council member identified youth as an area of underinvestment. A council member identified immigration services, and a council member identified zero waste, noting in particular the city's public stance on the closure of the Hennepin Energy Recovery Center, that lacks the investment at the scale necessary to divert waste effectively. In the next slide, we asked for council members' perspectives on how the city should fund its priorities and inform its approaches to the tax levy in this upcoming year, and where reductions may be appropriate. As part of the council's responsibility to ensure financial stewardship, budget, burden mitigation, and overall budget responsibility, council members were asked to indicate what range of property tax increase they would be comfortable supporting. The adopted levy for 2025 was 6.8%, and the projected increase for 2026 is 10.8%. Council members' responses range from 0 to 8%, with no respondents supporting a levy increase above 10%. The most commonly selected ranges were 2 to 4%, 4 to 6%, and 6 to 8%, indicating general support for a moderate increase. Next slide. Council members were then asked which priority areas they would support for increased investment, even if it meant a higher property tax levy. Council member responses indicated strong support from increased investment in affordable housing and homelessness, even if it resulted in a higher tax increase. Some council members indicated willingness to raise the levy for increased spending on other priorities. In the next slide, we asked where council members were asked to provide additional context for their previous questions. So on affordable housing and homelessness, they emphasized the urgency of addressing a multi-million-dollar funding cliff, the risk of losing state and federal funds, and the impacts of housing on public safety, public health, and economic vitality. They cited programs and projects such as the MPHA, Stable Homes, Stable Schools, Shelter and Transitional Housing, Affordable Housing Preservation and Maintenance. Council members identified transportation infrastructure and public spaces and emphasized the need for increased and scaled investments in neighborhood traffic calming, improved public transit access, and enhanced public amenities like benches, public restrooms, etc. Council members emphasized on effective public space and service access, the need for maintaining essential city services. A council member identified climate action and environmental justice and emphasized the need to expand green programs and projects, including weatherization, building retrofits, and the expansion of recycling and composting. Council members cited financial considerations as informing their property tax levy increase range choices, including cost of living, inflation and rising costs, and compounding economic pressures. Next, we asked which areas council members would support for decreased investment if it meant a lower property tax levy. The general themes here were good governance and civic participation, racial equity and disparity reduction, and arts, culture, and historical preservation. And some council members indicated a willingness to reduce spending in other priority areas to lower the levy. When asked for additional context on strategic prioritization and reduction, many council members emphasized the need for a more intentional approach to budget reductions, prioritizing essential services such as public safety, housing, and basic city services while identifying lower priority areas for potential cuts. They noted the importance of aligning spending with clearly defined core priorities, especially a high levy environment where trade-offs are unavoidable. We heard performance management and data-driven budgeting, pointing to areas like consultants and contractual services where there's a lack of metrics. We saw fiscal discipline and levy concerns. Generally, there was an emphasis that a 10.8 property tax levy and the direction that represents is one that's unsustainable, and noted the importance of making reductions in low priority areas. And that council members would not support a higher levy increase without first seeing spending reductions. On accountability and oversight, a council member emphasized public safety and budget challenges stem from weak governance and lack of accountability, not just funding levels, called for clearer expectations, stronger oversight, and more strategic alignment across departments and leadership. And then finally, a council member emphasized that racial equity and disparity reduction is something that should be embedded into all priority areas and not just as a standalone line item. This next section is citywide budget priorities. This section summarizes council members' citywide budget priorities, providing insight into where members see the most urgent needs as opportunities of investment. As part of our role in shaping the supplemental budget, council members were invited to share up to 3 citywide budget priorities. These were considered separate from ward priorities or region-specific priorities. In total, there were 27 identified citywide priorities, and 14 of those are unique citywide budget priorities, which represents a lot of alignment. So this table shows the citywide budget priorities from individual council members. In Appendix E of the report, you'll find individual submissions for just these specific priorities. I'm going to pause here instead of reading these off and see if any council member would like to take this opportunity to speak to any of their citywide budget priorities that they submitted. Not seeing any. We will continue. Oh, I see Councilmember Palmisano.
Madam Chair, I'll go ahead and share. I actually had a lot of things to share about every one of these categories, but I said it in my question response thing, the 84 questions that you asked us, and I'll say it again. My only stated priority is to reduce spending and limit any increase to the property tax levy. I understand that a small increase to the levy might be inevitable just to continue our current service levels, but this is why I didn't have any additional or new asks, because you can't do that and decrease the budget to the level that we need. So I'll just put that out there.
Thank you. I'll recognize Councilmember Wansley.
Thank you, Chair Chugtai. I think it's also important to name, because I've heard this come up a couple of times with the conflation of new spending and reappropriation of existing dollars, which many of us looked at also using as funding sources for budget amendments even last year. So just in your prior slide, when you said we're going to take a look, hopefully with the mayor's administration providing performance metrics around their programs, and not just at the department level, so we can see the full roster of what are we funding, how are they actually meeting the needs of our residents and overall enterprise functions. Then we could look at where can we use those dollars to support key priorities, as you know, what's illustrated on the slide. So I just need to make it clear, new spending is not the same as using existing dollars in someone's budget, in a department's budget, and repurposing it for a different project.
Councilmember Ellison.
Chiming in, we have a tough task ahead of us with this budget in this year, and maybe tougher than I've been here 8 years, and this might be one of the toughest situations we're going to be in as a council. And I think that it is really important that we highlight a lot of what Councilmember Palmisano is saying in terms of being mindful and being aware of how spending and how we're moving forward in that way. I also think it's really important to talk about the downsides of austerity measures and how they affect the most vulnerable populations and exacerbate problems like homelessness, like unemployment. Sometimes when we are not taking active measures, when we sort of lean into austerity, we can prolong episodes of economic downturn. We can prolong people toiling through the very systems we're trying to support them out of. And so I just think it's really important for us to highlight that, because we have to hold both, because we can't just increase the levy endlessly to solve those problems, but we can't, in my mind, lean so hard into austerity that we basically leave people in the dust. And so that's sort of the thing we have before us, and just wanted to highlight that it really isn't as clean and clear the direction we need to go as a council, because both austerity and increased spending can sometimes have negative impacts on the exact same populations. So we've really got to move forward diligently, and I know that we all know that, but I wanted to kind of name it, because I think that that's a little bit of the tension that we're feeling on this dais, and it's just those different approaches kind of coming right to the surface.
Councilmember Chowdhury.
Thank you so much, Chair Chugtai. For me, I put down affordable housing production and thinking about deeply affordable, that whole bucket of types of housing that you listed out in the presentation. And for me, I think this is about making sure that we're not cutting into the investments that we've made in prior years, or finding creative ways to continue making investments, whether it's finding ways to add additional funding to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or if there are things that would support policy to incentivize more affordable housing creation, right? We oftentimes talk about the Build More strategy kind of coming to a halt across the nation, and in our biz committee talking about not seeing as many cranes in the sky. And the real people impact of that is in a time where we're about 100,000 units behind statewide. There are individuals that are looking for housing, that need supportive housing, that are trying to age with dignity in our city. And so that felt like a big priority for me. And then I also put neighborhood traffic calming, because that's something that I hear from community members all the time. I feel positive that we can get increased support from the state legislature this time around, so we might be able to take that funding and put it right into our budget, which is exciting. And also, hopefully, if we didn't spend down the funding from last year, just continue to move forward in these projects, especially as we're looking at municipal state aid road pilots that have often been missing or have been missing from traffic calming. And the last thing that I'll just note, in speaking to the tension that we're feeling, and I shared this earlier, but I think I want to continue to kind of harp on it, is we don't have an evaluation tool to determine how things are working, to understand the efficiencies. Department heads are given the task of coming to present to us, and they're going to give us their best presentation so that they can get the funding they need. They are not the right people to ask where we should cut, and they shouldn't be. We need some independent evaluation of this, and I know that there's work that's going to happen in performance management and innovation. I would really like to see that work soon here before we start getting into the meat and potatoes of this budget process. But I also think this is a place where our auditor can lean in. Like, we need independent evaluation separate from the executive branch, separate from the legislative branch, to give us the information that we need. And I don't think Minneapolis residents realize that we don't have this tool in our back pocket to kind of make these decisions. And we were really, really fortunate for a number of years to not have to think about spending cuts. But unfortunately, that's the place that we are in, as are many cities and jurisdictions across the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'll recognize Councilmember Vita.
Thank you, Chair. I did not fill out the form. It was a lot to do. I guess my question is, when are we going to adopt the process of a biennial budget and actually have time to go through budget items and do the work that when we voted on the biennial budget, we said we would do? We would give ourselves the year off to go through budget items and actually look through the things that you asked in that questionnaire and figure those out for ourselves and how that matches up with the needs of our wards and our priorities. We have not had a chance to do that yet. And so I'm looking for the opportunity to do that. We adopted a biennial budget so we could have time off. The example that was always used was like, maybe Mayor Sharon Sells Belton put something into play that is still not there, but it's like we just keep going through the cycle over and over again. We haven't really had time to pause, look through the budget, and then the budget season is closing in tighter and tighter, it seems, every year. We started kind of in October. Now we're, what is this? April, May, like it's closing in more and more every year versus like stretching out over this long period of time. So I'm really asking for colleagues to like give us a chance to look through the actual budget and do things and prioritize in that way. My priority for the city is the lowest possible tax levy. I don't know what that means. I would not commit to anything without knowing what's going to happen at the federal level. I'm hearing from Public Works that we could lose $250 million in infrastructure projects. Like, my budget priorities will be completely different if that is the case. The federal administration is doing a whole lot of things that will be made aware of in every coming day that is going to potentially negatively reflect our budget here at the city of Minneapolis. There are other departments like the health department, which is a huge priority for me, that is going to take big hits because the federal government is closing they're shutting down their own jobs at the federal level, and it's going to trickle down to us. So this kind of feels like we're jumping out too soon. Not that you can't. I think people can share their priorities. It's fine. But like making commitments at a level of like what we're going to do feels too soon when we don't even know what we're going to have to react to. If we're even going to have money in our budget for just basic services, for us to keep the jobs of the folks who are employed here at the city of Minneapolis, we don't know. And so this just feels too soon for me. It feels like we just finished up December's budget process and we're already talking about budget priorities for something for finances that we don't even know if we have access to, and we're actually looking at cutting more than we've ever done in the history of Minneapolis potentially. So I wish we would be having more conversations about what is happening at the federal level, how that's affecting us, and what we can do to make sure that people keep their jobs instead of planning for next year and we don't know what resources we have.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you. That was well said. I also wanted to start by saying that was a very fair comment by Councilmember Ellison earlier. I appreciate that, and I wasn't able to say that exactly as well as he did. And the other way to think about it is that budget levy increases impact low-income residents the most acutely. So it is possible to both be wary of an austere budget, but also we're going to need to recognize the need that levy impacts are not felt evenly. In theory, I agree with the concept that we are underinvesting in affordable housing. In reality, we are doing as much as we can, as quickly as we can. I don't by any means think we should back off on the level that we're currently working, but we also have really important other city programs and services that are going to need our attention, particularly some that may have been disinvested in by the federal government. And I will say this over and over again, our residents cannot withstand another huge property tax increase. If we want to increase funding for something, we have to decrease funding for something else. And it's none of this cute short shrifting of adding in one-time money to backfill absolutely essential positions. Those are the things that increase our tax levy year after year. We need to live within our means. If our residents receive a cost of living increase to their wage, and many don't even receive that, this body even withheld 160 of them, then we need to live within that same range, and we still need to allow for their increased costs of utilities, of food, and etc. Changes at the federal level are already greatly impacting our residents and their ability to keep up with their monthly expenses and their rent and etc. And I think we have an obligation to not compound that with a large levy increase. There is nothing that should warrant a higher levy. We need to learn to reduce our spending and or cut programs or services. Thinking about a nearly 11% levy increase just to maintain our level of government is a total non-starter for me. We need to think about public safety and core city services as the starting point. To get a lower levy, I'm open to ideas. We need department heads to honestly review their services and make some hard recommendations about what they can live with and without. And we as a council, I think, and this is why I keep getting into queue here, we need to temper our expectations.
Councilmember Wansley.
Thank you, Chair Chuktai. Something else that I know colleagues and I have been discussing, and actually Councilmember Chowdhury brought this up, is this is also a really prime opportunity for us to lean into our intergovernmental relationships and partnerships. And also by us making investments in areas like public safety that doesn't just center traditional policing outcomes, but also even traffic calming, because the city of Minneapolis made significant investments in those measures. Now we have the opportunities and have had the opportunities where the state has actually also provided significant investments in that. That's how we got $19 million in public safety aid to support a lot of the public safety work that's already being rolled out, that's helping keep our community safe, but also it's spearheading a lot of the recommendations that I'm seeing even on the slide. Same with traffic calming. I don't think any of us imagine a world where the few $100,000 that we were pouring into a program that has been severely underfunded would now put us in a predicament where there's going to be a statewide program. So there are also key opportunities from us taking leadership and investing in significant priorities that have been identified by our residents that have allowed us to tap into other intergovernmental resources. And I see that as a prime opportunity that's highlighted here. Same with immigration resources. I think everyone recognizes that's going to be a key need. And I think as some of our colleagues are balancing this dynamic of cuts being made at the federal level and how that's harming some of our most vulnerable communities. Many of us are also thinking, okay, how do we leverage the resources that we have here to show up for those communities, like our immigrant residents and undocumented residents? And leaning into austerity doesn't get us there too for those key constituencies. And I would name this for actually our staff memo follow-up, because I asked this also in my meeting with the mayor's team around budgeting, was around actually what is this evaluation plan that they're going to be leading with as he's considering his budget proposal ahead of the August presentation, so that we can also understand how his team went and looked at the hundreds of programs that are operating now and what metrics are they using to evaluate either the reduction or removal of services prior to it even getting to us having to do that. So I will note that for a staff memo, if they can share with us the evaluation plan that they are using and when the results of that can be shared with council. Because I have not received follow up on that piece, because I think that is the biggest component. None of us want to make arbitrary cuts to programs, especially programs that in recent years, that's what we've seen, or at least what I've seen during my tenure in this council. Most of the programs that have been targeted for cuts are the ones that we have recently initiated, from sidewalk plowing to other housing proposals or programs. The safety ambassadors programs were also on the chopping block. Transit safety services were on the chopping block at one point. These are all recent programs that now we're celebrating. Now our residents are benefiting from, but without evidence-based or performance metrics in place, then we get into this place of actually the politicization of these programs. And I think that's not where we want to be. So the more we can have a clear evaluation plan that's provided by the administration or work with our own legislative staff to develop that, I think that is how we want to go into this budget season in making decisions.
All right, I'm not seeing any further discussion from council members looking to speak to specific citywide budget priorities, so we'll continue with this presentation. So over these next two slides, we will narrow down or conduct like a thematic analysis on what we saw from the 27 submissions. When we line up the citywide budget priorities with our strategic priorities, the top three areas of focus that council members saw was 1, transportation, infrastructure, and public space; 2, community safety and police reform; and 3, affordable housing and homelessness. Next slide. Now, narrowing from 27 unique or individual submissions down to 14 unique priorities and the top 3 themes, the top 5 areas where we saw shared priorities come in were affordable housing and homelessness, and everything from affordable housing production to preservation and maintenance to shelter funding and homelessness response, neighborhood traffic calming, minimal increase, maintenance, or lowering of the property tax levy, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs and their capacity, and geographically even redistribution of neighborhood safety department resources. Those were the top 5 areas of shared interest. In this next section, which is, we're going to go over the neighborhood or region-specific budget priority submissions as the areas of most urgent needs and opportunities of investment. Council members were asked to identify up to 3 neighborhood or region-specific priorities. And these are anything from, say, this specific ward to this is a priority that's going to benefit downtown, which overlaps multiple wards, or the south side, which overlaps multiple wards, or the north side, which, again, overlaps multiple wards. This section summarizes the full set of responses and highlights the cross-cutting themes that emerged here. In total, we received 20 neighborhood or region-specific priorities, and of those, 17 unique neighborhood or region-specific priorities. This table highlights the summary of the neighborhood or region-specific priorities that were submitted. Appendix F of the report has the coinciding submissions. And here, again, I will pause and see if council members would like to speak to any of the neighborhood or region-specific priorities that they submitted. Going once, going twice. And yes, we can go to the next slide as well. There we go.
Sorry, I'm struggling to put myself in
Councilmember Chowdhury.
I'll just quick speak to mine. The first, so all of the items that I put forward are things that we have previously funded. It's just, I want to lay out that these are things that I believe we should see fully through into the second year. So the South Minneapolis Community Safety Center, many residents in the 3rd precinct and across the city want to see the South Minneapolis Community Safety Center become reality. There is this timeline of second quarter of 2026. I don't want a financial barrier for that to happen in order for the safety services to be in place with our 3rd precinct officers at this location. The second is a transportation safety coordination program. Just an update that I've gotten from the neighborhood safety department. This was an allocation that I made when I first got onto the city council in 2023. They're currently in the design phase of this transportation safety coordination programming. It might be called something entirely different, but it will be related to transportation safety. But with an abundance of caution that they don't spend on the money this year. If they need more time to complete it, that's why I put this on there. And then last budget cycle, me and Council Vice President led on a budget allocation for small business construction hardship loan. If you go over to Hennepin Avenue, or if you have been on East Lake Street, particularly the farther eastern part, when there was Beeline construction, those were areas that struggled. I believe we have another corridor that's listed, it might be Lowry. I know that CPED is having current discussions about how they want to get this program up, and so that money has not been spent yet. It's kind of in the hands of our experts in that department, and so I just want to be able to see that through.
Thank you. And next I'll recognize Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair. And, I don't have a priority listed here, but, I certainly have been trying to foreshadow what I'm hoping doesn't occur, but we've already heard that, there's some $200+ million that are being pulled back from infrastructure projects, and it has the potential to impact the infrastructure project at 38th and Chicago or George Floyd Square. And, I really hope that we can revisit this issue so we can make sure that those funds are being expended to create the kind of infrastructure that intersection deserves and needs in order to improve the public safety, the livability, and economic improvements at George Floyd Square. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And next I'll recognize Councilmember Cashman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to comment on this $250 million. I think that was perhaps like speculation, or if Councilmember Vita has the actual numbers on that, if you could please share it with me, that'd be great. I don't want the community and or media to be picking up this number and to be hearing that as fact if we don't necessarily know.
Well, I did not say it was fact. I said that I was told by Public Works that could possibly be the number. And so you should listen. I didn't say that 250. So if the media picked it up, they would pick me up saying exactly what I said. And I was told that by Public Works. As the chair, you probably should get the number from them.
Thank you. So what I wanted to reiterate was let's not speculate on funds that we haven't necessarily lost. I do know that we are at risk of losing funds, and I can try to find out an exact number on that. But just wanted to note a reflection here that in the beginning of the presentation, infrastructure, transportation, and public space was listed 7th in the list of priorities by council members, but then was the top of the list for citywide budget priorities that council members listed. So it shows me that, maybe the survey, people got through the survey and realized, oh yeah, that actually is a very important priority for our wards. And I think it's very important that we don't let our infrastructure crumble and that we continue to make investments in this. And so just reiterating that it's an important place for us all to make sure that Public Works has what they need in the years to come. Yeah.
Thank you for that additional piece of context or for your comments, Councilmember. I think I'm just going to have Melissa just add some additional pieces of context that help distinguish between those list of top 10 priorities and what we saw from as emerge as themes. Go ahead.
There we go. Melissa Hill, Senior Policy Aide for Councilmember Koski, Vice Chair Koski. So Councilmember Cashman, to just further contextualize that a little bit, in reviewing the responses, it did emerge in the overall lower on the list, but the reason it arose later was because there was such a significant amount of council members raising specifically the neighborhood traffic calming program as a budget priority. So with that, it then rose to the top of the list. I think in that previous slide, it showed that there were 9 individuals who had raised that. So that brought it to the top of the list, as that was a significantly higher number of individuals. So despite that, it was lower as an overall priority. That one specific program was the reason in this section it rose higher.
Wonderful. If there are any, I'm not seeing any further questions or anyone else in queue, so we can continue here with the presentation. Now, doing the same thing again, where we line up each of these submissions with strategic priorities. The top 3 areas where council members see the greatest need for neighborhood or region-specific focus are 1, community safety and police reform, 2, transportation, infrastructure, and public space, and 3, economic inclusion and living wage jobs. So here we went from 20 submissions to 17 unique priorities down to these top 3 areas. And so we will, in the next slide, cover the areas of shared priorities. The 3 that emerged here were the South Minneapolis Community Safety Center, and in particular here, implementing proper programming at the facility as a priority, safety ambassadors, and making sure that these are expanded upon in this upcoming year. And then finally, construction hardship fund and loan program as one that was important to members. A theme that I think is important to note is just, in something that I see that's a little bit different this year than what we saw last year. We saw far more citywide priorities come in than we did individual and neighborhood ones or neighborhood or region specific ones. I think that's really, I think it's clear between this and the levy discussion that council members really are thinking about the constraint that comes along with this year's budget and are really thinking about how best to serve not just the residents that they represent, but how to make sure initiatives are benefiting other communities as well. So with that, we're ready to move to the next slide, which is financial policy considerations or fiscal policy considerations. I apologize. So here we asked for perspectives on financial policies and aspects of what's working well and where there are improvements needed. The results from here, and the goal was to understand what's working well, where improvements are needed, whether new financial strategies or approaches should be considered to better align all of our work. The vice chair and I intend to use the feedback to inform future report and presentation requests and policy work on financial policies as that continues. The results include credit strength and bonding capacity, helping the city maintain its AAA bond rating and access lower cost capital infrastructure investments, budgetary control at the department level, allowing just the legal level of budgetary control that the council has and the amount of flexibility departments have to reallocate resources without council input, at times council knowledge, and how that creates opportunities for misalignment, waste, and decisions that lack public trust or oversight. Status quo bias in current service level budgeting and that model, relying on current service level budgeting reinforces the status quo even when it is underperforming or not performing. And as that's a part of the budget that we don't dig into, procurement and contracts, transparency and accountability, this has emerged as a theme kind of from the beginning all the way to here with how low we saw good governance rank to areas of overspending to now fiscal policy considerations. And inconsistent evaluation practices, limited transparency, inefficient accountability and oversight were key areas that we saw lifted up. Vacancy savings, and how there are very few, if any, guardrails around this, as an area that requires comprehensive review and reform. And then finally, the need for, deliberate values-based reform, and more deliberate, clear guidance and flexibility here. In terms of this is going to be, I think, the last of where we go over fiscal policy considerations. So budgetary control at the program or line item, to enable greater transparency and accountability, outcome-based budget model. So both of these are really talking about budgeting models. And so, the third time that we really see this as an issue that's referenced in the feedback we picked up. Procurement policy and contract management. Again, the second time this is coming up here. Vacancy savings, legislative department, financial policy advisors and budget analysts, community responsive budgeting, climate and equity scoring in budget planning. this one was around considering environmental, public health, and equity impacts, especially for historically overburdened communities. So, I think about the introduction of the RIA into our how we review legislative items. This is a really interesting consideration, and municipal income tax as something that was brought up, and again, this is something that would require both consent and state legislative authorization, along with charter-based changes that would need to be made. So, but wanted to uplift that, again, folks are thinking about the impact of property taxes on residents and other ways to alleviate that. With that, performance management considerations are next, and should be, Councilmember Palmisano, I see that you may have a question here.
I do, Madam Chair. Is it correct that budget chairs might have a report back on our financial policies?
It's
like a third party review, like from ABDO or somebody.
It's undergoing review by our attorneys, and we have a meeting on Friday with the clerk and the attorneys, and to go over the attorney review of
those policies. But haven't we had it since like December?
The attorneys have had it since December, but I presume things take as long as they take.
So I just think that we should all be able to see that report before we have any discussion about our fiscal policies. I think that fiscal policies is a really good and important discussion to have, but I'd like to have it with that review that the city paid for in mind. I did make that comment in my survey responses, but it feels weird to be trying to have this discussion without it. But, when you think of general fiscal policy, one of the things that was said a little earlier is that many council members identified consultants and contractual services, particularly those that are lacking proper procurement evaluation, performance metrics, or accountability, as an area of overinvestment. I think it would be valuable in the go-forward nature of this budget priorities exercise, so thank you for that, instead of the retroactive look. Does this mean that this body, here's what I would hope for fiscal policies. I would hope that this body will stop proposing budget items or amendments that do not have proper procurement evaluation and accountability as part of them. Like nonprofits that circumvent the RFP process. It is only fair that we state that as a priority for our fiscal policies and that we follow that same guidance ourselves. It was mentioned earlier on this dais that Councilmember Cashman said how important transparency is to her. How was it transparent to choose nonprofits to receive funding without giving others a chance? How? We need to include that in our future fiscal policies.
Councilmember Wansley.
Thank you, Chair Chuck-Tai. I actually also want to say I'm full in support in some of, points made by Council Member Palmisano here. And I know there's an ordinance that I'm bringing forward to address that, especially in light of contractual issues. I reference, I think, in my survey, such as our rescue, and that somehow also circumventing the process that seemed to be facilitated by a council member and also staff. So we don't have other issues like that going forward. So I'm absolutely in favor of putting guardrails in place so that contracts are moving through a standardized process as well, and look forward to working with my colleagues on ordinance efforts to make sure things like that don't happen again.
Thank you, Councilmember Chavez.
Chair Chuck-Tai, I guess two of the points made by my colleagues, I'd like to see that information provided to the City Council when the mayor proposes his budget in August as a starting point. I think that would help bring more transparency into the budget proposals, making sure that what the mayor is proposing, which includes a lot of nonprofit funding, comes to light and ensures that we know how money is being used. So to my colleagues' points, I hope that starts, and that it starts when the mayor proposes his budget in August.
All right. Now continuing with the presentation, next with a summary of performance management considerations. The results from this section included expectations for performance data and budget integration, department and program level data. One is council members wanting to see performance management frameworks and metrics presented both at the department and at the program level to support deeper understanding, ensure rigorous and transparent decision making, a focus on outcomes, not just internal processes, disaggregated data by race, geography, income, and other demographics to support equity-focused analysis and identification of underperforming programs with context and space for course correction or reallocation. Accessible and comprehensive reporting, tracking year-over-year changes and the need to clearly identify the need. The need to identify I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Okay. Wanted to see a review of previous years and new items to understand trade-offs and impacts, and the need for independent oversight and stronger capacity. Council members emphasized the need to strengthen the city's performance management systems and introduce independent analysis with their budget decisions. And we'll go to the next slide and the one after. Yep, one more. All right. And this is the last section, which is process improvement, capturing suggestions for improving the structure, timing, and workflow of the annual budget process. Our goal was to identify what aspects of the process currently support clear, collaborative, and informed decision-making, and where adjustments could strengthen the process and outcomes. And we plan to share this feedback with the budget director along with performance management and innovation to help make sure this feedback continues to be captured. Next slide. I'm going to run through these really quickly. And in terms of the feedback here, the budget, the major themes, and there are actually several here. Budget address as a positive example. Seeing the mayor's budget address telling a cohesive story that links financial decisions to resident impact, and that council members found this to be a helpful approach and would like to see it more so reflected in formal budget materials. The lack of alignment with strategic plans, and that the budget book and the recommended budget do not clearly reference or align with adopted strategic plans, and it makes it harder to assess whether proposed investments are serving long-term goals. Next, we heard no retrospective or long-term outlook, that materials lack reflection on prior year outcomes and offer very little forward-looking context beyond the biennium, and that this gap limits the ability to assess the trajectory or sustainability of proposed investments. Insufficient context and narrative around budget changes. Again, this comes up especially in the year-over-year context. And makes it hard to understand where and why cuts are happening and how those trade-offs shaped changes. Insufficient program level and line item detail. This has come up over and over throughout different sections here. Improved online tools, but finding that navigating them is still a barrier. So the use of OpenGov and online budget tools is something that council members find benefit in, and that usability and user friendliness remains a challenge. And then compressed timeline limits review, and just that departmental hearings, and when they wrap up, and when those next steps in the budget process take place, compresses the timeline and places a tremendous amount of pressure on council offices. We'll move to the next slide. Overly technical and lacking analysis. Presentations are really technical and do not explain foundational budget items and terms clearly. Limited strategic and historical context, really missing, and I think this in particular speaks to the amount of council members that are new here, or at least have started since 2020. So I think that is really clearly reflected here. Unclear drivers of the levy, clarifying the cost of current service levels. I think this was a lot often connected to insufficient detail, insufficient context, and then the need to have more time to review. We saw in the next slide feedback on departmental presentations. The big pieces of feedback here are centering the need to center performance management systems and metrics, including clear program level performance data, and including outcomes, successes and failures, and highlighting those, requiring honest assessment and reduction recommendations, clearly show and explain budget reductions, and improve timing and engagement. In the next slide, this is feedback on public hearings and community engagement. So holding public hearings in the community, I think this is something that we should strongly consider, and can happen. Improving timing and early access, and in particular how late that truth and taxation hearing happens, and that it's too late for us to incorporate the feedback that we receive. I know there's some statutory considerations here, but this is a really a salient argument or point. Better promote early hearings, because some of those early hearings are often not that well attended, or are dominated by organized interests in our city. And maintaining evening scheduling, and making sure that hearings are evaluated as a part of our process. And then next slide, and this is feedback on the markup process. The themes that emerged here were strengthening amendment submission standards, setting and enforcing hard deadlines, limiting the volume of amendments, supporting council-led amendment development, increasing administrative collaboration during markup, and improving quality and objectivity of department response. And with that, we'll move to the next slide, and that concludes this presentation. Are there any final comments or questions before we move to our last two items? All right, Council President Payne.
Thank you, Vice President Chugtai. This was an extremely thorough report, and I'm even looking at this as, how might future councils look at this report in future budget years. I think this was like a really helpful iteration on how we're going to refine the council orientation and responsibility to the budget. And so I just want to thank you for all the thoroughness of putting this together, and Vice Chair and team.
Councilmember Rainville.
Thank you. I have to excuse myself because I have an emergency meeting with park officials about the mass shooting on the riverfront. And ironically, because of the council amendments that have moved so much of the safety ambassador money around last year, probably won't have the dollars this year to help on the riverfront. So we'll see how that checks out. But that's why I said in my statement that we should be more evenly distributed with that citywide resource for the safety ambassadors, because I really can't see a path where I'm going to get those on the riverfront or downtown this year, and it's very disheartening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Chavez, followed by Vice Chair Koski.
I just wanted to make some clarifications on that part. So, in fact, the mayor had actually proposed cutting those safety ambassadors by, I think, half. And as council, some of us decided to save funding of that program. So if we wouldn't have done that, there actually would be less resources for these safety ambassadors. I think for us, many in this body have been very clear that we want to support these safety ambassadors in all cultural districts, including downtown, which is why we worked with Councilmember Rainville to include his area as a place that we want to see these programs expand. But I did actually want to clarify to the public, we put in $3 million for safety ambassadors, including the area that Councilmember Rainville is talking about, I believe. But it needs to be said, those were on the chopping block when the mayor proposed cutting half of that funding last year, and some of us in this body were able to find the money to save that program. It wasn't a decision the council made to defund the safety ambassadors. In fact, it's about implementation. There is money there to implement the programs. We want these on Lake Street and East Franklin Avenue. They're there as of this month. That is great. We're excited. And other areas in our cities deserve that. And that means the Office of Community Safety needs to implement the programs now.
Vice Chair Koski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank you, Chair, for helping to make sure that we continue this robust process. You know, as we started this last year, and we've evolved in this process. I've appreciated just the continued additions. You know, I think it's great that we're getting more feedback from colleagues about how we can make this process better, and that feedback. And of course, we're always open to it all the time. But thank you so much to all the colleagues who participated in this and gave us this information. And I just want to shout out to Melissa Hill, who is the individual who put all of the information together after everyone gave it to you. Just really thank you for continuing to move through this process. We're learning and we're doing it together, and we're working on this together to make sure we have transparency and collaboration and connectivity with the community. And I'm grateful that we've continued on that path. So thank you.
Thank you. With that, that concludes the discussion on this item. I am going to move approval of the item to transmit the authorization to the council president and myself to transmit to the mayor the City Council's 2026 budget priorities for inclusion in the supplemental budget. Do I have a second on that?
Second.
All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? The ayes have it, and that motion carries.